Hey guys, so today we're talking about the Fujifilm X-T4, which I think is the best camera right now for content creators. So in this video I want to give a little review and we will also find out why I think it's the best. So to give a little perspective here, the cameras that I used before most of the time was the Panasonic GH5 and the Canon EOS R. I'm also shooting on the Canon M6 Mark II right now to show you the Fujifilm here. We'll also blend in some B-roll. So let's talk a bit about the specs that are most important for me on this camera. I'm not a photographer, at least not professionally. I shoot occasionally photos, but I mostly shoot videos, so I mostly focus on the video specs here. But I will also talk a little bit about photos later, at least as far as I tested it. So the most important feature here for me is having 4K 60 in 10-bit. So the thing is, some of you guys might use 60p or 120p or so in 1080p, so you get slow motion in other cameras as well, but it's 1080p. 4K just looks a lot better and you have more data to work with, so that helps a lot when I edit my videos. For example, when I crop in and I do some animations and so on, it's just better to have 4K. Having that in 60p so that I can also do slow motion, that just helps a lot to make my videos better. Aside from that, 10-bit internally in 4K. This is great because I also do a lot of color grading. So what that means in reality is that when you color grade your footage, especially if you shoot in log or another flat picture profile, that you don't get so much banding or you don't get any banding at all in the sky, and you also have less color artifacts and so on, especially in areas where orange hits blue and so on, that are usually problematic areas. So it's really helpful. It's not really that it makes the final result on YouTube that my viewers see better, or my clients when I send them the videos, but it helps me a lot with the workflow, because like when I have 8-bit footage, then in color grading I all the time have to look how I can fix some issues with the footage, how I can resolve some banding to make it less obvious and stuff like that. But with 10-bit I can just color grade and it's done. I don't get these issues, so that makes my overall workflow a bit faster. It's not just about making the footage look better, you won't really notice the difference. It's really about video editing, how can I speed up my workflow. So 10-bit is really great for that. So 10-bit is the bit depth, but what this camera also offers is pretty high bit rate. So you can shoot in 4K up to 30 frames per second in 400 mbits, and in 4K 60 you can still shoot at 200 mbits. And to be honest, the footage that I get out of this camera in 4K 60, 200 mbits, 10-bit, it's just great. Like I did not have any issues color grading that. On the Panasonic GH5 before, I used the Atomos Ninja V recorder all the time, so then it's a lot heavier setup, you have to set everything up and so on. It's not really fun to work with, but here I can get really good quality directly in camera, so I don't need the Atomos Ninja V anymore. And another feature that really differentiates the Fujifilm X-T4 from the Panasonic GH5 is the autofocus. So on the GH5 the autofocus was barely usable, but on the X-T4 it's actually very good. It's not as good as the autofocus on the Canon EOS R, I would say. It's like it's a bit quicker, a bit jumpier, it doesn't feel that smooth. And also, like, let's say I vlog and I look somewhere else, then the focus on this camera tries to focus somewhere else. So that's sometimes a little bit distracting, but if you know how this focus works on this camera, if you know where the weaknesses are, then it's actually very usable. Like it's very fast, it keeps the subject in focus all the time as long as you look in the camera or you have the subject on the focus point. So the autofocus works perfectly here, it's just not the best on the market. And the reason why that is so important is that for content creators, you oftentimes have to step in front of the camera, and then on a GH5 and other cameras with bad autofocus, you usually use a smartphone app, then you have to set the focus on your face and lock it and so on, and it just takes more time. So right now, even with the Canon M6 Mark II, which also has great autofocus, I could just sit in front of the camera, I don't need to worry about the focus, it just works, and that's exactly the same on the Fujifilm X-T4. The next spec that's very important for me is IBIS, so inbuilt stabilization, that you can get smooth shots directly straight out of your hand. You can get that with the EOS R2 when you turn digital stabilization on, but digital stabilization crops in, and it's also not as good as inbuilt stabilization because it sometimes locks on a subject and then it looks a bit weird, like laggy, and you don't want that. So here it's a lot better. The IBIS of this camera, of the X-T4, is not as good as on the Panasonic GH5. Panasonic GH5 just kills all other cameras on the market except I think the Panasonic S1, so Panasonic is just the leader in that regard. But the inbuilt stabilization on this camera is good enough. So the only issue that it really has is that sometimes when you pan a bit slower, that it looks a little bit laggy. But it's very easy to resolve that in post. You just add some stabilization and it looks smooth and it doesn't crop in that much. It's really okay to resolve that in post, no issues at all. But I must also say that when the Panasonic GH5 came out, it also had similar issues with the IBIS. So I think that there will come firmware updates in the future where Fujifilm makes it a little bit better. A little tip that I can give you here: when you move the X-T4, when you pan with it, just move it a little bit faster at the beginning and then become slower. It seems like the IBIS then recognizes the motion a bit better and then you don't have this laggy issues there. And the next spec is something that really impressed me on this camera, and that's the low light capabilities and the dynamic range. When I got the Canon EOS R before, I expected that it's a beast in low light because it's full frame and so on, and coming from a GH5 I expected a lot, but it was actually not that much better. As a GH5, like, I could raise it one stop more to have usable noise levels, but on this camera, the footage that you see right now was shot on ISO 10,000 in f-log, and log profiles are generally not good in low light because they give it a little bit more noise. But the footage looks absolutely usable, like even straight out of camera without any color grading. There is definitely noise visible, but it's not bad. It's still, you can view it, and after color grading it actually looks pretty good. So the low light capabilities of this camera are amazing, and when I turn f-log on I also get a huge amount of dynamic range here. Don't really like compare it to other cameras or have it in numbers, but it's great. It's really good. So if you worry about low light because the sensor is not full frame and so on, I can calm you down. It's totally fine. You won't be disappointed. The next spec that I really love on this camera is not a must-have, but it's great that it has that, and this is the film stimulation. It's basically like picture profiles on other cameras, but here it actually looks a lot better. Like before I switched to Canon actually because everyone says that Canon colors are so good, and it is. Canon has very nice colors, but these colors are even better. And with colors I don't only mean the actual colors, I also mean how the overall image looks, because it's not just colors that defines the look of an image, but it's also the roll-off and the highlights and the shadows and so on. And this camera, the X-T4, actually handles that much better than other cameras and other digital cameras at least. There are actually people that say that Fuji cameras are, from all the hybrid cameras, the ones that come closest to cinema cameras like the Arri Alexa. Of course, don't get it wrong here, it's not the same, but it comes a lot closer because of all these nice roll-offs and so on. So in post I usually only have to add a little bit more contrast and saturation. I don't do that much with LUTs and so on. Like sometimes I apply my Tange green LUT. That's the LUT that I use most of the time. You find the LUT pack in the description below, and that just matches the colors a little bit to my overall look that I usually have, but there's really not much color grading necessary anymore. So especially if you're a YouTuber and you want to publish a lot of videos that look great, then this film simulations help you a lot. And one more feature that I like, but that's also not too important for me, is the photo capabilities of this camera. It's actually great for shooting photos. It's not just a video-centric camera, and that's good because I figured out that when I used the Canon EOS R that I also started shooting more photos automatically, and it seems really like some cameras are just better for photos, others don't. Like the GH5 for example, it also shoots decent photos, but it doesn't really invite you to shoot photos, and the Canon EOS R invited me more to do that, and it's the same here on the Fuji. Sometimes I just see something, it looks good, and I think I don't really need a video of that, just a single image is totally fine, and then I just shoot a photo. And I also have this nice film simulation colors here, which is great, classic chrome in photo mode. I also have great raw photos that have good quality, you can do a lot with it. So it's good that it's not just video, it's also photo. And it's also one reason why I think that this camera is so good for many content creators, because many of you guys shoot maybe photos for Instagram, then videos for YouTube and Facebook maybe. Facebook is like half photo, half video. So it's just great to have a camera that does both pretty good. Then there are also a few smaller things that I really like about this camera that I just want to mention here quickly. So at first, the flip screen, this is great. I would never buy a camera without a flip screen, simply because I want to film myself and I want to see myself, don't want to attach a monitor all the time. So that's great. Some photographers don't like it because it takes a bit longer to take the screen out and so on. But is that really an issue? I don't think so. Then another thing that I really love is the Fringer adapter, so you can attach Canon lenses with that, and the autofocus actually works great, so that gives you a lot more lens options. And then what no one really talks about is actually the SD cards. I use the SanDisk Extreme Pro 170M. It's a newer card, but it's still V30. So actually the Panasonic GH5 only gave me 22 seconds of 4K 400 Mbits recording with this SD card, but the X-T4 and also the EOS R, they seem to have better card readers or higher buffers or so on. I'm not exactly sure why, but I can record with 400 Mbits on this camera without any limits as far as I tested it. I tested it for 2 minutes and it didn't break up the video. So that's great because it saves a lot of money for SD cards. The V60 and V90 cards are just a lot more expensive. And one small thing that's not that important, but the electronic viewfinder is really good. It's very colorful and bright. So when I looked through it the first time, I was really like, wow, that looks good. So it was actually no camera that I ever watched through before that gave me this wow effect just because of the viewfinder. It wouldn't be a deal breaker if it wouldn't be like that, but I just want to mention that here. Of course, there are also some downsides of this camera. It's not perfect. First one is that the grip is pretty small, like especially with a heavy lens like the Sigma 18-35. It feels pretty front heavy. I don't like that. It's also not a deal breaker. I already ordered a L grip from Small Rig there. That should help a bit. Then what I also don't like about the screen is that you can only take it out from the side, but not from the bottom. Like on the GH5 and the EOS R, you could just go with the thumb like that, and then it opens, but here it's not possible. It's a bit unfortunate because that usually goes a bit quicker, but it's not really a deal breaker, and I'm already used to that, so no problem really. But worth mentioning as well, you won't like that when you just come from one of these cameras. And also the settings of this camera needs bit of time to get used to it. Like it took me about 2 or 3 hours until I was comfortable with this camera, because with all the dials on top and so on for video shooters, it's good to have that. It makes some stuff a bit easier, but overall when you come from other cameras that work differently, you really have to find your way around it. So what I can give you here as a tip, just set the shutter speed, no, the ISO to C, set the shutter speed to T, and set the EV compensation also to C, and then in the menu set it to movie mode, because then the settings are very similar to other cameras, and that makes it a bit easier for you to control it when you record video. For photo, just go back to photo mode and use the dials as they are supposed to be. It's actually nice to have all of these options here. It's a bit quicker than setting it up in the menu or through wheels, so it's good to have that, even if it needs to get some time to get used to. So now we got all the specs, but the question is still, why do I think that this is the best camera at the moment for content creators? As a content creator, you must be flexible. Like sometimes you shoot a video like I do right now of yourself, where you need the flip screen to see yourself, to frame your shot, and you also want to have good autofocus, as I mentioned before. Sometimes you shoot videos for clients where it's really about the best quality, to deliver 10-bit and stuff like that, do more color grading, be accurate with colors. Then sometimes you shoot photos for Instagram. Like you need a camera actually as a content creator that does pretty much all, and it should do it as good as possible, and this camera, to be honest, does all of that very good. I would say it's actually the best in some cases, like for example 4K 60 10-bit. No other camera right now offers that internally, aside from the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K and 6K, but there you don't have inbuilt stabilization, so you can't really just shoot from your hand. You need some sort of stabilization for that, and this camera just has that also. This is really a feature that this camera does best. I would also say that the colors on this camera are best, at least if you want to have more analog film style cameras, and still crystal clear. And if you shoot Eternal or log, then you can also color grade it as you want. So even if you want to have more vibrant colors, that's not really an issue here. So yeah, that's why I think that this is the best camera for content creators. It's not the cheapest one with $1,700, but it's also not that expensive. The biggest competitors of this camera in the future, I think, will be the Canon R5 and R6. The R5 will be less than $4,000, but which is still more than twice the price than the X-T4. And it has great specs. It's probably the best camera that will be on the market in the future for some time, with 8K RAW and all the stuff, 4K 120. This is great. But it's all stuff that we don't really need as content creators, so why would I pay twice the price or even more for features that I don't need? It just doesn't make any sense. R5, I expected it would be in the $2,500 range, as the Canon EOS R was when it came out. I think it was $2,300 or so maybe a little bit more. That will be basically this camera but with a bigger sensor. But the question is, does it really matter? Because I was not impressed by the dynamic range and low light capabilities of the EOS R. So we will see how it is, but still, then this camera will be maybe $700, $800 more expensive than the X-T4. Also, the X-T4 is more lightweight, more portable, and so on. And what many people also don't consider when they buy a new camera is the cost of the lenses. And here you can definitely save a lot of money on lenses, and no one will be able to tell the difference later, especially if you work with fast prime lenses all the time. So overall, I think this is the best camera for content creators. Maybe if it's still too expensive for you, then you should have a look at the Panasonic G9. The autofocus should be good enough on this camera, at least as I've seen in some tests after the latest firmware upgrades. Also, the video capabilities of the Panasonic G9 are great. So if you're more entry level, if you don't want to spend so much money now, totally fine. It costs somewhere around $1,000, at least here in Thailand. It's not $1,000 here in Thailand, 1,000 euros around. But if you buy it used, it's probably less than $1,000. So this is definitely a cheap option to start with. And at $1,700 for the body, that's, I would say, the best camera that you can get right now. And to be honest, I don't think that anyone will need another camera or a better camera within the next 5 years, because let's be honest, most people don't even have 4K screens. Many people watch on their smartphones, on tablets, or smaller screen sizes generally. So even 4K is a bit overkill still right now, even if I personally love to shoot and publish in 4K. But I don't think that we will need 8K or even 6K or something like that in 5 years. So this camera will definitely be enough for a pretty long time. So much for the X-T4 here. I really hope you enjoyed the review and it could help you a little bit to make a buying decision in case you don't know what camera to buy right now. If yes, then please leave me a thumbs up. And also, if you want to have more reviews in the future and you want to learn a bit more about filmmaking, make sure to hit the subscribe and the bell notifications button. See you in the next video.